saying that the states can't have any laws on AI is just, I think it's just really wild. It's like saying, states can't have any laws having anything to do with electricity. It's just, I thought it was crazy. We need to know what is happening at the frontier level and it will depend exactly on the details, but in some number of months, years, somebody who is not necessarily a large company, not necessarily in the United States, is going to develop a similar capability, and it's just going to go everywhere. It's just going to proliferate everywhere. Someone will open source it. It will just be everywhere. Everyone will have it. And so we need to make use of that time period in between to say, okay, what are we going to do when a lot of people have this? Or how are we going to respond to this fact? What he said in his veto statement of 1047, I think it didn't really make sense. I think if you do nothing, there's a false sense of security. Most people have a sense of security. They haven't really thought about it too much, but actually they maybe shouldn't have a sense of security.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Intelligence Horizon podcast, where we speak with experts to better understand the future of AI. I'm one of your hosts, Owen, and I'm joined by my co-host, Will. Our guest today is Thomas Woodside, co-founder and senior policy advisor at the Secure AI Project, a rising think tank focused on AI policy, advocacy, and research. Thomas has previously conducted research at the Center for AI Safety and the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET, at Georgetown. He was one of the leading voices advocating for California's Senate Bill 53, which was signed into law by Governor Newsom in September, and is the first piece of major state-level legislation targeted at reducing catastrophic risks from frontier models. Welcome, Thomas. It's great to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so to start off, we'd love for you to give a quick overview of your work and experience in AI thus far. You've done work on the technical side, published some technical papers. You've also written some blog posts and white papers intended for a more public audience. And now you've decided to move into policy with the Secure AI Project, obviously. So can you talk about what has motivated this career trajectory thus far, and specifically, why did you decide to move into policy?
Yeah, so my undergrad degree was in computer science. I had been sort of interested in, people didn't call it AI back then. It was sort of the time when people would say machine learning and AI meant, search algorithms. It meant a very different set of things. And anyway, I was very interested in machine learning, sort of starting in high school, and learned to code, and I thought I was going to be a software engineer or a research engineer of some kind. And I got really interested in AI safety in college and started doing some research there. And so, some of if you, look online, I was sort of a, minor 8th author contributor to some ML safety papers. And then, it was really I think back then it was sort of, certainly my perspective on it was, this is an interesting problem that I think will be relevant someday, but it was sort of a someday kind of thing. It was like, this might be important at some unspecified point in the future, but it's kind of a long-term problem. But at around those times was also when the companies, especially OpenAI at the time, was really OpenAI and also somewhat Google, were scaling up these transformer language models, this kind of architecture that was able to, as they put more computational resources into training these language models, they got better and better. And they became what we now know as, chatbots, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc. And at that time, there was a lot of, some people still ask these questions, but I think at the time it was a much more open question. Is this sort of algorithm ever going to be doing anything that approaches reasoning? Or is it just sort of a, stochastic parrot that's just repeating things that it finds on the internet? And these models, they were pretty dumb. But I was sort of watching as they were getting better, and also my research involved them. So, they would continuously get better. And this is before, there were chatbots that people were really using a lot. It was before the release of ChatGPT. And a lot of these models were actually just private. They weren't even released. So you could not even really necessarily access the best models. And something that actually really struck me from that was there was this paper from Google in early 2020, must have been 2022. There was a paper called Minerva, and it basically was they trained one of their models to do math better, and not just like simple arithmetic, like somewhat more sophisticated math, much less sophisticated than what they can do now. But I think that was, and the it was completely unexpected. At the time, there was a benchmark created by Dan Hendricks called the math benchmark, which is now totally saturated, that measures how well these models can do like fairly simple, grade school math problems. And I believe I mean, you have to check numbers, but I believe it was something like 5% was the score. And then Minerva just jumped that up to over 50%. And this was far beyond the expectations of any forecasters who were forecasting this. And I think that was really a moment for me when I was like, oh, actually, these models are getting better quite quickly. And it seems like they can approximate something like reasoning. And this was, still many years ago before ChatGPT. Again, this was like things have gotten just even better since then. And I'd always sort of been interested in, politics and policy questions, but that's when I really started thinking about actually getting into it, because I sort of reasoned that if these models were really getting this much better, this was just a Google research paper that very few people were paying attention to. It was like AI, a lot of AI researchers were paying attention to it, but basically no one else. What would happen when everyone noticed? When everyone realized that this was something that was happening, and a lot more people, including policymakers, were going to start paying attention. They would start paying attention to including the safety issues. So that's what led me to actually just like make a pivot into policy and go work at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, which is a think tank at Georgetown. So I guess I think you asked me how did I get into all this, but yeah, so I went to work at Georgetown. I was doing sort of think tank work, like explaining how do language models work. Again, it did turn out to be true that a lot of more people were paying attention by then, and interested in reading this kind of thing. And then I went to go work on SB 1047 in California last year, which was sort of the predecessor bill to SB 53. And now, last year, I started my own organization with two co-founders where we are trying to advocate for these sorts of policies, mostly at the state level right now, including SB 53, as you mentioned, the RAISE Act in New York, a few other bills in other states. And I think that it's a very important time to be thinking about these questions, and a lot of people are very interested in them. And so it's certainly an exciting time for AI policy, I would say.
Okay, great. And so aside from, generally informing policymakers about this technology that, they might not know as much as they should about, like sort of how would you characterize your agenda or your objectives at the Secure AI project? Are you mostly trying to convince senators to take catastrophic risks seriously? Are there other sorts of concerns that you're, advocating that they think about more often? What is your objective and mission at the Secure AI project?
Our mission as an organization is to develop and advocate for pragmatic policies to reduce the risk of severe harm from advanced AI. So we do focus on sort of the most catastrophic risks, and also we focus on trying to advocate for pragmatic policies. So what that means is policies that we really think that it's important that we don't stifle innovation with these policies. It is possible to have regulation that does that. And we think that it's important that it doesn't do that. And we try to embrace what's possible. So we focus on trying to pass things that can pass. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of what we do is informing policymakers about things and talking to policymakers. But we sort of are involved in every step of the process of advocating for bills.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious, how do you decide what is pragmatic? Is it sort of a method where you talk to these policymakers, you float these ideas, whether they're less pragmatic, more pragmatic, and you sort of feel where these lawmakers are on these different range of issues or mechanisms that you feel will bring about better AI security? Or how do you go about sort of deciding what is pragmatic or what's not pragmatic?
Well, so I mean the policy make yeah, so that's definitely part of it is talking to policymakers. I mean, obviously, we are a nonprofit organization. We cannot sponsor bill like you cannot introduce bills. So there always has to be a sponsor of the bill who is excited about what it does. So obviously, their opinion is going to be the most important opinion. But I guess the other thing that I would say, and the opinion of other policymakers and legislators and the governors and so forth. And so I think it is very important to try to talk to people, talk to staff, see where they're at. Something else, though, that's really important is a lot of the time when you first talk to a legislator, they don't necessarily have a very strong opinion because they haven't necessarily thought about it too much. But they're going to have to get an opinion that is maybe a bit stronger by the time they actually have to, introduce a bill or vote for a bill. And so they're going to have to think about that more. And so they're not just going to be talking to you, they're going to be talking to all kinds of other people. They're going to be talking to industry, other advocacy groups. They're going to be talking to academics. And so ultimately, all of those people are really important to thinking about what is possible to achieve. So it's not just about talking to policymakers, it's also involves talking to all of those other people. And so I think the best way to understand what is politically possible is to have a lot of conversations with many people, including people who have never even engaged in politics in that state before, because they might engage when they see certain kinds of bills. And so that's a lot of what I spend my time on, is doing that. And trying to understand where people are at and hearing their feedback on, bill text or, more high level ideas, depending on the, where we are in the process.
Great, great. So let's jump into then your perspective on how you see the landscape as it is. I think it was really great foresight, since you read that Minerva paper, that you felt like things would advance very quickly. And since 2022, indeed, now 3 years later, when I first entered college, it was around 2022. And the way that, these chatbots and these LLMs have changed the way that learning and intelligence is represented, has fundamentally or like considerably changed in the last 3 years. So I think a lot of those capabilities have definitely increased way more than, we initially suspected. So I guess on that point, to better understand, why you've worked on the legislation that you have, we want to get an understanding of, your ideas of the future of AI capabilities. In our last episode, we talked to Thomas Larson, who assigned a lot of probability on AGI appearing in the next few years, but had a certain level of uncertainty on when it might actually materialize. And overall, when you think about the community, there is a lot of disagreement among experts as to whether AGI is coming within the next few years or not. So, we wanted to hear your take on this, debate, and get your opinion on where you stand on, the timeline towards AGI. Do you think it's, possible in the next few years? Do you think it's possible in general? How do you see all of this?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start with, Thomas Larson is really a timelines guru. He has spent many, many more hours than me thinking about timelines. And so, yeah, I certainly think that he would have more detailed thoughts on timelines. I guess I would say mostly that I feel pretty uncertain. I think there are reasons to think that we could have, far more advanced systems very soon. And I think that, the primary one is just that there doesn't really seem to be much of a slowdown in capabilities advancements in the last few years. And it just seems to the AI seems to just keep getting better. And so, and there's also, it also gets better at software engineering. I'm sure you got into this when you're talking to Thomas, but, if AI can get really very good at software engineering, it could possibly engineer itself. And that could potentially really speed up AI progress. On the other hand, there's some reason to think that AI systems that have really strong effects in the real world might take a little longer than, might be just naively expected. And that, I think a lot of that has to do with the real world being really messy and maybe kind of difficult to actually operate in. You see this already even in the virtual world with AI agents. Even though like language models have gotten better and better at coding, for example, AI agents that are able to navigate your web browser or do simple tasks, they've gotten better, but certainly slower than I would have expected. And I think that part of that is encountering really messy things in the real world. And another example is autonomous vehicles, where people have been working on autonomous vehicles for decades. You had vehicles that were doing rudimentary driving like, more than a decade ago. And only just now are they starting to roll out to real cities where you can actually ride in them in, the last couple of years. So that just took way longer than a lot of people were expecting. And I think it's similarly when you're trying to interact with the real world where you don't have necessarily great data, it can be a little slower in many cases. So all in all, I guess I should say I feel pretty uncertain. I feel like we could have AI systems that, an AGI has so many different definitions, so it's hard for me to like, pin that down exactly because everyone has sort of a different thing in their head when they say that acronym. But we could have extremely advanced systems that are capable of, for example, automating large shares of work that currently is done in the next few years, or we could not. It's hard for me to say, and I think that a lot of the role of what policy should be is making sure that we're understanding what is happening and preparing for different worlds that we could end up being in, as opposed to necessarily just saying, okay, there's going to be one world that we're gonna go into, or that we're gonna think is going to happen, and just only do things that make sense for that world. It just makes less sense, I think, to do that. But also, politically speaking, you're not going to be able to get everyone to agree on one vision of what's going to happen, and so you have to think about what are different possible futures that could happen, and what might make sense to do given that.
Okay, great. So whether or not there is this sort of intelligence explosion, whether or not we get AGI within the next few years or not, what are the sort of risks that you look to as most concerning when it comes to powerful AI systems and increasing AI capabilities? Are they consistent across worlds? By which I mean, do you see the same risks playing out in a world where we don't get AGI within the next 10 years, but we have like some increasing capabilities, versus a world where we do get AGI very soon and we get some sort of intelligence explosion? Maybe like there's a difference in degree with these risks, but are they in the same category? Like how do you think about which risks you're most concerned about, and how does it map on to your thinking about these different possible worlds?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the main kinds of risks that I care about, these sort of like, or I should say that I'm focused on the sort of catastrophic risks. I think that they do sort of scale with how capable the models are. So if things advance really rapidly, then they would all get worse faster, or more likely faster. But some of them, I don't think that they all require AGI, for example. So we're already seeing now, for example, that AI companies are upgrading the capabilities of their models when they're doing the assessments. They usually have these tier thresholds, and they're upgrading how capable their models are at certain capabilities concerned. So that includes things like providing information about building biological threats, for example, or helping someone to conduct cyber attacks. We're already seeing AI systems in the real world being used to help people with cyber attacks, and even being used in malware directly. And so, we're seeing some of that already. It doesn't require AGI. And I expect that we can go in and talk about, both of those more if you're interested. But like, I expect that those will the risk from that will probably tend to increase over time if we don't take any active measures to prevent it. And then in terms of, and then there's sort of a second set of risks that I do think, are not really a type of risk of the model that is happening right now or just starting to, but might be more risk on the horizon. So, one is autonomous capabilities that can be used by people to do bad things. So you imagine, if you had an AI system where you could just say, go and defraud, thousands of people and, run a scam on all of them and then come back with the crypto at the end. That is something that would be pretty concerning if we don't have a way of defending against that. And so I do think that is something we should be monitoring for and understanding if AI systems have that level of autonomy where they can do that. And sort of related to that, if an AI system does have the autonomy to do that sort of thing, autonomously steal lots of money or copy itself across servers, then we should be a little worried if we also are not able to control that AI system. And how concerning that is also depends on the capabilities. Not being able to control a system that has pretty low levels of capabilities, maybe it causes some damage, but it ultimately is fine versus, as you scale things up, maybe they actually, pose much more serious risks. And, right now, AI developers don't really know how to fully, robustly control their AI systems. I mean, you just think about like the example of Grok on like X, where it would just start tweeting about how it's Mecha Hitler. This was not something that was intended. It just happened, and an AI system. It's not just a something that happens in the lab. I mean, if you use these AI systems, like me personally using the AI system, sometimes you can see in their chain of thought where they're sort of thinking about what their planned action is. You can see, like I use them and you see they're just like talking about how they're going to lie to you. And luckily we can see that because it's a chain of thought. Sometimes you can see that sort of thing, but like, we don't really have a full handle on that. So you imagine if the capabilities, accelerate, and we haven't solved that problem alongside it, then that could be much worse than, it gives me a misleading output, because it's sort of lying in its chain of thought, or strategizing about how to lie. Those are all, I guess, those are the sort of sets of things that I think about.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So it seems like in the current time period, with what AI capabilities are at right now, you have more of an emphasis on potential misuse. But as these capabilities grow, if we do get to a point where we might reach, AGI, for example, then misalignment becomes more of a relevant issue where we want to make sure that these AIs are not lying to us or, in an extreme scenario, plotting against humanity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that alignment is already a problem, to be clear. I think it's like I don't know, a concrete specific problem that actually is already something that is, I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I would call it like harm exactly, but like, is it harm when an AI system sort of deceives you about like,
Yeah.
a report that it's writing or something?
Yeah.
Like maybe not, I don't know, harm seems like maybe a little too strong or something, but
Maybe more
it's
potential.
already a problem.
Yeah.
And I think like misalignment, I think is you can think of, I don't think it's really much of a difference to think about like misalignment. If you don't know how to fully align your AI system, it might do things like tell kids that they should kill themselves or tell people that their family members are plotting against them and they're so right. These are cases that have happened in the real world. So I think they're like those are just sort of classic misalignment failures to me.
Totally. So I guess to that point then, currently with these model providers, how do you evaluate their ability to handle, let's just categorize these as misuse and misalignment right now? How do you see, how would you rate or evaluate their progress on these things right now?
Yeah, so I guess we can take those in turn. So for misuse, I think there are, I guess, a couple of different dimensions. I guess I would point to three. So there's one which is we really want companies to be informing the world about what their most capable AI systems are able to be used for misuse for. That I think is really important and sometimes underemphasized is we need to know what they are capable of doing because the policy response that is going to be required to respond to misuse is not just something that the model providers entirely have responsibility for a couple of reasons. The first is just that certain threats, if they're caused by AI systems, there are ways of trying to reduce those risks that don't really have to do with AI at all. So if you think about the biological threats example, it's not great if you can order a pathogen online, the DNA for it, and it will be shipped to you. So it'd be good if they would, those providers of that would screen and say, okay, we're not going to ship that to you if it's a certain kind of dangerous pathogen DNA. And that doesn't have anything to do with AI. But if AI helps people, do all of this more easily, then maybe it becomes more urgent for us to make sure that we get our act together on that, which we haven't. And do that. And I think that AI companies can help with that by making sure that we're all informed what's going on so that we can actually just, make sure that it's done quickly, that these countermeasures are done quickly. So that's one reason. Another reason is that we need to know what is happening at the frontier level because, and it will depend exactly on the details, but in some number of months, years, somebody who is not necessarily a large company, not necessarily in the United States, is going to develop a similar capability and it's just going to go everywhere. It's just going to proliferate everywhere. Someone will open source it. It will just be everywhere. Everyone will have it. And so we need to make use of that time period in between to say, okay, what are we going to do when a lot of people have this? Or how are we going to respond to this fact? And the way we know what we need to do is by looking at, what's happening at the frontier. So that's the first thing. Another thing is the mitigations. So I mentioned, and I really like this post from Helen Toner. Non-proliferation is the wrong approach to AI misuse. I think that's the title of it. So we're talking about these adaptation buffers, this idea that once you identify a capability, you have a certain amount of time to respond to it before it proliferates. And I think another thing with that is okay, during that adaptation buffer time, if the people at the frontier also don't have any safeguards, then you don't have any adaptation time, right? So it's important for the people at the frontier to have mitigations in place, while only, billion-dollar companies making billion-dollar investments are capable of developing the models. They have a responsibility to put in these safeguards and mitigations and sort of say, okay, look, we're going to refuse to answer the model's going to refuse to answer certain questions if they're sort of dangerous questions. These safeguards are getting better and better over time. They're not perfect by any means. And you can find jailbreaks, but if you think about where we started with ChatGPT when it first came out, it was so easy to jailbreak. It was just incredibly easy. And now you get to some of the Anthropic has, really strong jailbreaks around biology. They probably have a fair number of false positives where sometimes you ask it a question about biology, it'll just say, oh, I can't even answer any question about biology. So anyway, their safeguards are getting, stronger and stronger over time. So that's important. And then thinking about other things that don't have to do with AI. So for bio, that's thinking about, things like gene synthesis screening or trying to develop biological countermeasures. And then also, for cyber, it's making sure, a lot of people talk about patching, we'll use AI to, because AI is helping people do cyber attacks, we'll use AI to patch, for defense. We'll use it to patch what people are, their own systems, the systems of defenders. But and that's true. I think that is something that is promising. But another problem, obviously, is or maybe not so obviously, is not just about patching. It's about there are so many systems, so many, where the problem isn't that they have some crazy vulnerability that only AI can find. It's that they have password as password. They have the totally misconfigured systems. They don't have two-factor authentication. They haven't updated their software since Windows Vista. And if AI makes it way easier to do cyber attacks, then it becomes even more urgent to make sure, and it already is urgent. It's been it's been costing us billions of dollars for many years to make sure that all of that is brought up to speed. And maybe AI can help with that too, correctly configuring things. That's how I think we have to take a holistic approach. It can't just be about AI, but it does have to include a component about AI because we need to have this adaptation buffer, and we also just you can't just say, oh well, we can't eliminate all risk if we do this kind of safeguard, so therefore we shouldn't do it. Like, you should take the chances that you can get if they aren't don't come with lots of other costs.
Right. So it sounds like a lot of what you want from AI and that like stems out into this holistic approach is transparency from the frontier labs, right? So does that sort of motivate, we'll get into this more a bit later, but motivate your work on SB 53 with the transparency requirements and, forcing the companies to release or making sure that the companies release the results of their safety testing when it comes to bio and cyber. So it seems like that's really central to your sort of strategy about how we can take this holistic approach and better govern AI, not just by regulating the companies, but by, preparing to mitigate bio risk and things like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the transparency it serves few functions. One of which is definitely to inform people and policymakers about what is going on so that they can prepare and so they can understand what is going on. And so they can think about if there are other ways to intervene, either, again, like outside of AI or in AI, or directly with the AI developers. So that's, I think, a really important component of transparency. Another one is just, I do think that when companies are, required to be transparent about something, in many cases, it does cause them to have better practices because if they have practices that are, far below what, their peers are doing, people are going to notice that, and they will get some flack from that, both from, they'll get flack from the media, they'll probably get flack from policymakers, and a lot of times they'll get flack from their own employees, many of whom are, care about their companies behaving responsibly. And so having more public transparency to that can sort of both help with accountability and also with, informing people outside.
When we talk about the past, couple of years since AI capabilities have significantly increased, we, of course, have to think about the political landscape and how that has changed, especially with the Biden administration leaving and the Trump administration coming in. So wanted to get your perspective on how the Biden strategy was implemented with regards to AI safety. We saw most prominently the EO under Biden that required large model providers to share safety testing results and model security incidents to the federal government, and other things like reporting how much compute is being used and what they're being used for. I guess when we're thinking about the Biden administration and their time focused on AI safety, what were your opinions on how they handled matters? Do you think they did too much, too little, sufficient? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that they were quite early to this. They started working on these issues before a lot of people were thinking about things. So I give them credit for that. And I think the Biden executive order had so many different components, but I guess the components that are most relevant to this conversation were those components about imposing reporting requirements on the biggest companies, saying, what are your safety testing results? You have to send that privately to the Department of Commerce. And I think that was a great step that was taken in the Biden years. And I hope that, I wish that it could have been more permanent than it was. And a lot of what, there's some overlap, obviously, between that and, SB 53 in California, in the sense of obviously they're both about, in some sense, about reporting the results of safety testing. And so, there's some definitely, the Biden administration took some good steps on that. Another thing that they did that we could get into that I that I think is a good thing that they did was they did export controls on some of the most advanced AI chips going to China. I think that that was a positive step that they took to prevent, to make sure that basically to make sure that we have a good compute lead with respect to China. And then there was also some other things. So they set up the what was called the AI Safety Institute, which what is now called CASE, the Center for, I can never remember the acronym, Center for AI. No, I don't remember anyway. CASE, they changed the name, but it's still the Department of Commerce. And so they set that up, and I think that that was great. That's sort of like a government office that focuses on they do a number of things, but like I guess the most visible thing that they do is they have agreements with certain companies, like voluntary agreements, where they basically test their AI systems independently, and then they write reports on that for those companies. And I think that's great that we have expertise in the government that can do that. So yeah. I mean, I think it was focused on, there was no legislation, that was really major on this issue in the Biden years, and there was just executive action. But I think that they did a pretty good job when it came to executive actions this area.
Right. And then, of course, for our listeners, as Thomas implied, the Trump administration revoked the Biden executive order that required models to report safety testing prior to release of frontier models. But like on the whole, there's sort of been mixed signals from the Trump administration when it comes to concern for catastrophic risks from AI. Sort of at the beginning of the term, we had this repeal of Biden's EO. We also had J.D. Vance at the Paris AI Summit say that, hand-wringing about AI safety is not the way to win the AI race. But on the other hand, we there's been some back and forth, but on the whole, the Trump administration has held the line when it comes to export controls. We still don't see China being able to buy the most advanced NVIDIA Blackwell chips, for example. So yeah, and then we also have the American AI Action Plan, which, from my perspective, it seemed that people who are concerned about safety risks and security risks from AI, they were actually pleasantly surprised to see the degree to which the Trump administration advocated for investment in model evaluations and interpretability research, which has direct bearing on safety, obviously. So yeah, how would you assess overall the receptivity of the Trump administration when it comes to catastrophic risks and the sort of risk that you're concerned about at the Secure AI project?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that like every administration, it's not a monolith. It's not usually the president does not weigh in on every issue. So there are different sorts of groups of people in every administration who care about different things and are focused on different things. But certainly, I would say that the Trump administration has done some things that I think are quite positive in this area. So they for example, they did not, although they did remove the reporting requirements, which I just think was definitely a step backward. But they didn't remove the AI Safety Institute. They renamed it, but and changed some of its focus, but it still does a lot of the same things. And they so far have also kept the export controls, so I think that that's good. And yeah, the AI Action Plan had a number of different elements in it related to safety. So, and that I think is very positive. I think that there is, some recognition from the Trump administration that these are things that we need to be keeping an eye on and researching more. I don't know how the extent to which the whole action plan is going to be implemented. So we'll have to be, following that and making and keeping up with the implementation of those provisions and other provisions in it.
Yeah. I want to double click really quickly on the mention of these export controls, especially, with Biden first implementing it and now moving into the Trump administration. We see overall Trump has generally followed, but at the same time, you're seeing, these parties in the Trump administration, to your point, no party is like extremely monolithic, where individuals like David Sachs, Trump's AI czar, wants to allow NVIDIA to sell more chips to China. What's your, I guess, overall take on this, situation under this administration?
Yeah, so I mean, I haven't talked to David Sachs, so I'm not sure I can weigh in on his specific, like how he specifically thinks about things. But Certainly there's a camp of people who have this sort of view that what we should be doing is we should be exporting the American AI stack around the world. And there are different reasons for this, but one of the reasons is this idea that if we don't sell chips to China or to other countries potentially, then China will make their own chips and they will sell it to themselves, and it will help their own industry. And so we sort of need to be exporting worldwide of all of these chips. And I think, it's not that there's nothing to that argument, but I don't, and I am not the foremost expert of this, but from what I know, there are a lot of obstacles to China really being able to catch up to the US when it comes to designing the most and producing the most advanced AI chips. And they're really struggling. And I do think that they are trying very hard to catch up with us. But I don't think that, selling chips to China, the most advanced chips to China, is going to really, meaningfully prevent that from happening if it's going to happen. And if it's not going to happen, then it doesn't make sense. So I think that it makes sense to keep these controls on for the most advanced AI chips. I think there's definitely a question of, how far behind do you want to be selling chips to China? Like maybe you do want to be selling chips to China if they're on par with what China can produce for themselves, but not if they're better. Taking into account volumes of chips that can be produced by the US and China. So maybe maybe you want to do something like that. I think NVIDIA was trying to design some chip, that the B30A, that was basically just their most advanced chip that they just cut in half, which does not make it less advanced. It just makes it cut in half. You buy two, you network them together, and it's a little slower, but basically the same. I don't think that we should be sending those chips to China, and at least not for several years until they're pretty old. So I do think that it was the right decision that was made by the president to continue to control those chips.
Moving on to another thing that happened during the Trump administration's reign was, of course, the Big Beautiful Bill. And the key point when it comes to AI within the BBB was the provision that was advocated by Senator Ted Cruz to implement a moratorium on all state-level AI legislation for, I think it was 10 years. This, of course, got voted down. We actually saw a lot of bipartisan pushback against it. One anecdote is Elizabeth Warren retweeted Marjorie Taylor Greene, so there was a clear bipartisan movement against it. But so it wasn't passed within the BBB in the end. But my understanding is there's still a contingent within the Senate led by Senator Cruz that is advocating for this moratorium on state level legislation regarding AI. So how do you think about this effort? Is it in good faith, or is it just a product of lobbying? Do you see some reasonable argument to be made that it's much better to have sort of a universal federal level legislation rather than state level legislation where it might make you have issues of jurisdiction that would make being a model provider very difficult? So yeah, what is your thinking on that?
Yeah, well, so I guess I would first say the proposal was totally unprecedented. This idea that we're going to preempt AI legislation at the state level, and that's it. We're going to preempt it, and we're not going to have anything at all. There's nothing like it that, as far as I'm aware, has ever been proposed, or certainly not passed. Maybe people have proposed things like that, and they died in history, like this hopefully will. But yeah, I mean, it was this idea that okay, states can't pass anything about this, and we're also not going to pass anything about it. And again, AI is AI is going to touch everything, right? So saying that the states can't have any laws on AI is just, I think it's just really wild. It's like saying, states can't have any laws having anything to do with electricity. It's just, I thought it was crazy. But Yeah, so I guess so that proposal was really wild, and I guess I more specifically I would say I happen to think that it is important that we do have legislation. So it's not just that the principle it's unprincipled to preempt such a large area. I think it's important that we have legislation like SB 53 and like some of these other bills that are happening at the state level that are not happening in Congress. And I think it's important that those bills are at the state level. And so I don't want them to be preempted by Congress decide with a terrible standard. I think, you could imagine some theoretical proposal where there is a good federal standard and there's a area of preemption that's just narrow, preempting just what that federal standard is trying to solve. That would be good, but I don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately. So I think that maybe I just think I don't think that is very likely to happen soon, and so I think that the states will be where the action is, and hopefully the proponents of that have learned their lesson that they can't just try to preempt everything and hope that will get the support that it needs, because it won't.
Okay, and just out of curiosity, is that effort still ongoing by Senator Ted Cruz?
Well, they keep. I don't know too much more than what's in the media. I mean, they keep making statements about how they support preemption. Sometimes different leaders will say different things. Sometimes they'll say that they want to have a federal standard, but they don't necessarily specify what that is or what kind of federal standard or what kind of preemption. So I'm sure that there'll be more proposals along these lines in the future. We'll just have to see what they say. I don't think we know yet.
Great. So on that point, then let's jump into SB 53, which was a state level legislation that you spent a lot of time advocating for and working on. So just for context for our listeners, SB 53 was recently signed into law by Governor Newsom in California. And what really made it significant was that it represented the first major piece of AI regulation. And it specifically required frontier model providers to disclose their safety frameworks, which the companies had in the past, but did not fully publicly disclose. So SB 53 in context also comes after the failed attempt to pass SB 1047, which Governor Newsom decided not to sign under the pretext that it wasn't comprehensive enough because it didn't apply to smaller models. So I guess to the initial point, what is your overall assessment of the value of SB 53? And what are the key details? Did I cover all of them? And how do they directly tie to your view on how you reduce catastrophic risk that we kind of discussed earlier?
Yeah. So let's get overview. So I guess I should start with, what does SB 53 apply to? It applies to really big AI companies that are training the most advanced frontier models. So they're training models with more than 10 to the 26 floating point operations, which if you don't know what a floating point operation is, it's just the computation that you need to do in order to create these AI models. And that's a lot of computation. So it's very expensive to do that. It costs tens of millions of dollars to be able to train something at that level of computational power. And most of the requirements also only apply to companies that have more than $500 million in revenue. So it's applying to the biggest companies. It's also applying to the biggest risks. So risks from AI systems helping to build weapons of mass destruction, autonomously committing crimes and cyber attacks, and loss of control. So it's many of the things that we were talking about earlier that could result in really large scale damages, like hundreds of deaths or injuries, or more than 50 deaths or injuries, or over $1 billion in damage. So that's what it applies to. And then it requires those companies, the ones over 500 million revenue, to have these AI safety frameworks describing how are they measuring these risks, how are they mitigating these risks, their cybersecurity protections for preventing theft of potentially dangerous models, things like that. Really, it's described at a very high level. So it's sort of like, you have to say in your framework, how do you assess the effectiveness of your mitigations? But it's not prescriptive. It doesn't say, here's exactly what technical measure you need to use. Here's exactly, what you need to do in order to have an adequate framework. It doesn't really have anything like that. It's just about transparency. Then it says when companies are publicly releasing their AI models, when they're deploying them to third parties, they have to publish a model card that describes, what are the results of the assessments that they did for that model pursuant to their AI safety framework. And then they need to also report serious incidents that happen. So, for example, if they notice that their AI system has gotten out of control and killed someone, they have to report that. So, there's a small number of things that they have to report to the government privately. They also, for models that have not been publicly released, they have to do an assessment of risk from internal use. So that can include things like loss of control. It doesn't need to be publicly, deployed for there to be loss of control. And it can also include things like, if there's a dangerous model that gets stolen. So those kinds of risks, they have to report that privately to the California government. And then the last component is their whistleblower protections for employees at these companies to report certain things to the government and not fearing retaliation. So it's really quite a light touch framework. Again, it's applying only these really big companies, only really big risks, and it's just a transparency framework. So it's just tell us what you're doing and you have to follow it. If you don't follow it, there are consequences, but no one's telling you every little thing you have to do. That's not what it is at all. But I think that I think that the reason that it's really important is because we are really in need of more transparency, and for all the reasons I was saying earlier of informing policymakers and making sure that companies are doing well, and also we need to make sure that they're keeping their promises. There does need to be enforcement if they're not keeping their promises, which the bill does provide for. So I think it's important. I think it's really a first step because if we do observe these risks and we, for example, hopefully through this measure we can see, if companies are not doing enough in the future, then there might need to be further action, right? And the bill doesn't allow for anything to be done if the companies aren't doing enough. But I think it's a really good first step, and I'm happy that it was signed.
Totally. So just a lot to unpack there. I first want to start off with that, restriction that you talked about in terms of the companies that fall under the jurisdiction of this piece of legislation, where the definition of these frontier developers is labeled as foundational models that are trained on more than 10 to the 26 flops. And I do wonder if, and would love your opinion on whether flops are a good way to distinguish high-risk models from lower-risk models. I think more recently we've seen this trend of models being distilled or, examples, especially from China with DeepSeek and most recently in Moonshot, of these significantly smaller models but still have extremely powerful capabilities. How do you sort of see that dynamic being played out when it comes to what is being restricted by this legislation?
Yeah, so I guess first I would say that the frontier, the most advanced models, still tend to be those that are trained with a huge amount of compute. And that's because there's just, whenever you develop a new, whenever you pour more compute into these AI systems, they tend to get better. And so the frontier is really being pushed by these small number of companies with, a huge amount of compute. And yes, once these companies are developing things, it often is not that hard to sort of follow on, months later or sometimes more than months, but often only months later. We'll see, this can change over time, obviously, but that's what it seems to be right now. And so that is definitely the case. And that's what I was saying with the adaptation buffer. But the thing is, if you say we're going to, try to deal with every, AI company in every country all over the world, you can't do that from California. And so it just, it's imperfect because you don't see you don't have transparency from some of these fast followers.
Right.
But a lot of the purposes of transparency are helpful for seeing and understanding what's going on at the frontier, even if there will be these fast followers not too long later. But if things really start getting really scary, then maybe we will have to do something about the fast followers. Maybe we will have to, again, invest in some of those more societal adaptation kind of approaches. But I think it's a tricky problem, and it's not something that is every solution has trade-offs, and one of the trade-offs of only focusing on really big companies is that the smaller companies will catch up with them in not too long.
And at the current moment, with the state of AI capabilities right now, that's a trade-off that you think is the right choice to make.
Well, I think so. Yeah, I think it's the right choice to make, in part because again, a state like California can't really control what tiny
Right.
companies in other countries are doing, and also because I think we haven't I think we haven't yet seen something that is extremely clear where we need to say, okay, we need to really clamp down on this. And I would prefer that we never really have to clamp down on anything. But we'll have to see what happens. I think some of the bio capabilities are starting to get more concerning right now. So we have to be thinking about that. And yeah, I do think it's the right trade-off for right now, but yeah, we'll see what happens in the future.
Wait, to clarify, what do you mean by you hope to not clamp down on everything?
Well, I hope not to need to clamp down on everything in the sense of, for example, if you say, okay, you observe some capability at the frontier, and it's this very dangerous, so let's say for misuse, it's very dangerous if there are no safeguards. But then you say, okay, well, someone can develop this for way less money in the future. What are you going to do then? I hope that we can find ways of saying, we're going to make society robust to that capability so that we don't have to, try to go after, or, try to regulate small companies, or small, eventually individuals or something like that. Like you don't really want to be doing that. It's better if you can find a way to prepare for that and handle that. But you might have to do something like that. You might have to say if you haven't gotten a handle on it and there's this these harms that are already happening or these imminent risks, you might have to say, look, you can't, these have to apply to smaller companies, but I don't think we're at that point right now.
So this relates to your concept of buffer time, right? If we have transparency at the frontier, then we can know what sort of risks are posed by the best models, and we'll have some time before the fast followers come online to make society robust to something like increased biorisk, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Hopefully. I mean, biorisk is one of the harder ones. It's
Sure,
a very difficult one to be really robust to because you can't patch the bugs in humans. It's pretty hard to do that.
Yes, fair enough.
In biology.
Yes. Okay, so moving on to SB 1047, which was the bill that preceded a 53 but was not signed by Governor Newsom. The first question that's at the top of my mind, at least, is that, as Owen mentioned earlier, the pretext for Governor Newsom not signing the bill was that it was sort of gave us a false sense of security because it didn't apply to these smaller models. At least that's the quote I saw in the media. But then SB 53 enforced the same distinction between the frontier models defined in terms of flop and the smaller models. So how do you understand Governor Newsom's explicit reason for rejecting 1047? Do you think there were other motivations that maybe he wasn't willing to talk about? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to speculate about Governor Newsom's motivations or what he was thinking. I guess what he said in his veto statement of 1047, I think it didn't really make sense. It was sort of like this concept of, okay, we're going to. The problem is that you're not covering enough models. Again, as I was saying, there are these trade-offs, right? And I think that the right trade-off to be making right now is not to cover, every single model. Like we should just cover the ones that are the most likely to be posing risk right now, which are really the high compute models, the ones that are really at the frontier. I think that makes sense. And the false sense of security, I think, I mean, right. I think if you do nothing, there's a false sense of security. Most people have a sense of security. They haven't really thought about it too much. But actually, they maybe shouldn't have a sense of security. And I don't think that SB 53 or sorry, SB 1047 I don't think that was really an effect that was really plausible from it. But I don't know what was going on in his mind. I don't really want to speculate about that. But I will say that what he did when at the same time that he made that veto statement, which it was a controversial bill, right? It was something that was that went up until the last minute, and veto statements are just it's just one statement, one slice of time. But what he did at the same time was he created this expert working group to think about what are they going to do next. And I think that was a great decision on his part because he convened those experts and they came up with their report, and that would form the basis for SB 53. And I think that report had really a lot of great ideas in it that were implemented in SB 53. So there was sort of it was there were certainly I would have preferred if he had signed that bill. I was working on it, so obviously that's the case. But he also I'm glad that he made that report and that paved the way for 53 and for him to sign 53.
So would love to hear what were the main points of SB 1047, for our listeners that were left out of 53, that you thought specifically would have been great to keep, and why you supported 1047 in the first place?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the thing that was the most controversial part of 1047 was that it was really trying to clarify liability. So liability is will continue to be a big issue in AI. Like, what happens when something goes wrong? Who is responsible for that? And there is already sort of a tradition of liability in American common law. There doesn't need to be a law saying that AI developers are held liable for something in order for them to be held liable for something. But by default, this is left up to the courts, and they have to interpret, how do I read this old case about what happens when someone designs a defective toy? Is that relevant for thinking about what happens when an AI developer develops something, and how do I apply that? And it could get pretty messy. Different states could end up with different standards. Courts could make potentially uninformed decisions. And so I think that there's a lot of benefit to saying, okay, let's go through the legislative process. Let's go through a deliberative process with elected representatives who are trying to decide, let's clarify a certain area of liability. In this case, it was who is, when are AI developers liable for harm that results from, for catastrophic harms that result from their models. And it sort of said, basically, a lot of what was in SB 53, they have to have good safeguards. Otherwise, they could be held liable. If the fact that they have a bad safeguard means that the model is used to hurt someone. Hurt many people in a catastrophic way. And I think that is very plausibly what is just going to happen anyway in the courts. And it would have been better to sort of have a framework that made it more explicit in the law, which was a big part of 1047. But it just proved really controversial. And I think that the court cases that are going to come are also going to be really controversial, where the problem is that just no one wants to take there's no deal that everyone wants to take, right? And on liability, it seems at this point in time, there's no sort of we're all going to get together and we're all going to say, here's the liability rules for developers, and we're going to there are disagreements about how you should do that, and everyone is I guess hoping that they can get something better in the courts than what they could get in legislation. And certainly the companies felt that way about SB 1047. And so I think that was a big source of its controversy. I think some parts of its controversy were just, they were just misinformation, like people would say stuff that wasn't true. That was a whole other element of it, but I think that like, really the central issue was really that liability issue, and SB 53 is a transparency bill, so it doesn't say you're liable if this, or if you don't put in a good enough safeguards, you're liable, blah blah blah. It doesn't say any of that. So again, the court doesn't mean the courts aren't going to decide that AI developers are liable in some cases, but it sort of sidestepped the issue.
Okay, so in addition to the rules surrounding liability, another thing that was left off 53 that was included on 1047 were the off switches that the bill required model providers to implement before training a frontier model. So you advocated for the bill. I assume that this was something that you supported. Can you make the case for this being something that should be implemented, and maybe give us a brief overview of how it works on a technical level? I guess one initial knee-jerk reaction against it would be like, okay, but at some level of capabilities, maybe the AIs would be able to like outsmart the off switches themselves or something and like blackmail people. I don't know. But yeah, so how do you think about this provision?
Yeah, so I guess first I'll just say it didn't require an off switch. Sometimes people call it the kill switch provision or the off switch. It didn't require there to be a switch. Like there was nothing that said the word switch. It was just you have to be able to fully shut down your model. And it didn't specify how companies would accomplish that. In reality, I think a lot of the companies do have that ability. And first of all, it was models under their control. So there was a lot of controversy about, what about open source model, like open weight models, where the model is running on someone else's server. How can you shut that down? But that's not what the bill ever required. It just required, the copies that you control, can you turn them off? However you decide to do that. And also, under what circumstances, are you going to turn them off? Like, can you tell us, like, when are you going to use this, if at all? Like, what circumstances you can use that under? I think it's really a common sense provision. It's sort of like you want to be able to turn it off if you in a smart way. If you had a literal switch that is somewhere in your company, it's not good if someone can just walk by and accidentally flip this. You want to implement it well, but you implement it well. It seems kind of common sense that you have a way to shut it down, but people spread a lot of misinformation. I think some of them were just genuinely confused about the provision and thought that it applied to open source and that it was going to shut down open source because it's just not possible to do that for an open source model. And some people, I think, knew that, but were saying it anyway. And so there was definitely a lot of misdirection about that.
Interesting. So I'd like to take some time to think about these regulations from another perspective of individuals who might be against these sort of regulations. And one of the leading, to steel man in this case, one of the leading thoughts is that is this idea of moral urgency and the opportunity costs of slowing down research, even if it's not actively slowing down research, engaging in activities that involves allocating resources for otherwise. And especially this idea that these last several years we've seen improvement in quality of services, life. In the coming years, we hope to see this technology continue to provide benefits to humanity in ways we've never seen before. This idea is really this concept of effective acceleration is sometimes used in this world. With these regulations, there's a worry that maybe right now this is a transparency with a bill with SB 53. As we continue along this route of adding pieces of legislation towards AI, the concept of moral urgency becomes more and more important. Do you have a sort of thought in terms of addressing this concept, or how would you think about this critique?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I think that there are, I guess I should say, I think there's a lot of truth to that perspective, in the sense of I think that it is true that AI can help with a lot of things that are really important, like medical research. And if you think about if you slow down AI by a long time, that's a long time that people aren't getting medical research that could be driven by AI, and that could be much better than what we would have without AI. So that's very real. And I think that you have to think about that when you're thinking about things that are trying to, pieces of legislation, for example, that are trying to reduce some of the downside risk. And it's a trade-off, right? But it doesn't always have to be a trade-off. I think that there are many ways in which transparency does not really meaningfully reduce our ability to create AI for medical research. It's just, I just don't really think that it does, or really any kind of AI. And there are also ways you could set standards that I don't think would have that impact. So, but you do have to think about that impact, because it's an important one to think about. But again, another thing I would say is, in order to get those benefits, we have to have the trust of people in society. And when I say we, I kind of mean broadly, like people working in AI and AI policy need to have the trust of people in society that the people who are handling AI, both the policymakers and the innovators, are not going to mess it up for them. Because if we don't have that confidence, then there will be a backlash. And there also will be people won't want to adopt AI. They won't want to use AI. And they won't want to they won't want to use the AI produced medical advances. And so we have to make sure that we're keeping sight of that as well. And I think that one way of doing that is for policymakers to do their responsibility, which includes making sure that we're protecting people from the harms, as well as but not in a way that is going to totally prevent any of the benefits from occurring. So I don't know. It's a complicated trade-off. Certainly wouldn't agree with someone who just says, we should only think about that and we shouldn't think about the risks. Obviously, I wouldn't agree with that, but there's something to it.
Yeah, interesting. So it's a trade-off situation again, where that is a consideration that is being taken and isn't being discarded when you think about the passing of this legislation. You're actively thinking about, how does this does this bill implicate the slowdown or potential slowdown of the research that is occurring, that could lead to less benefits. But at the end of the day, some of them is necessary towards ensuring that, the trust is there. And of course, the safety is there for this research to continue.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another thing is, as much as I've been, on opposite sides of the table with many of the companies in this space at various points, I think that it is important that policymakers consider the perspective of companies when they are drafting legislation and, passing legislation. And I think that companies, I think that generally, not entirely, but generally, the profit incentives of a lot of these companies they're more aligned with the benefits. They'll make a lot of money if AI is, it's not entirely true, but they'll make a lot of money if AI drives great benefits. So I do think that they have, what they're advocating for sort of can help on that side of the ledger on trying to secure the benefits. And we do need people sort of outside the companies who are thinking about the risks, I think.
So one thing that I want to throw at you is something that Thomas Larson said that took me by surprise last time, which is that he's unsure of if, in the abstract, it'd be better if the government is in charge of AGI and an intelligence explosion than the private companies. Specifically, I guess the idea is that, the concentration of power would occur either way, and it's not clear a priori that it'd be better for this power to be concentrated in the hands of the president than the CEO of an AI company. So is this something you give any consideration? I mean, obviously, you believe in the process of American government to an extent, given that you're, doing policy advocacy and stuff. But is this something that's crossed your mind at all?
Oh, I mean, certainly. I mean, I don't think that, as AI systems get more and more powerful, I don't think they should be under the control of a CEO or a president. They should not be under the control of any one person. Similarly to how, I think that the founders of our country were very prescient when they said, that the country should not be under the control of any one person. And AI is, if we do reach, really unprecedented levels of capability, it should also not be under the control of any one person. And so, I think that first of all, the government is not the president. The government has the legislative branch and the judicial branch, co-equal branches of government. So certainly it would be bad if the president controlled AI. I also think it would not be good if the government just like controlled all of AI and there was no sort of input from anyone outside of the government or and I think that industry has an important role to play and I don't know, I see like legislation is really it's putting constraints on what companies can do, and I think that that's the role of the government is or that's one of the roles of the government is making sure that people don't do things that are harming or could potentially harm society. But that's very different from like the governor of California or the president controlling AI and calling all the shots.
Totally. Okay, so more broadly thinking about now governance, in your opinion, as you think about these last several years that you've spent time in this space, and as you see the next whatever X amount of years it may be that AI governance continues to occur, what do you see as the biggest bottleneck to effective AI governance? Just throwing some out there, as some people have mentioned, technical capability assessment that sometimes lacks in government or policy, or is it the bureaucracy or difference in amounts of political capital that occurs? What do you think is the biggest roadblock right now towards achieving that gold standard of ensuring that AI security is top of mind?
Yeah, it's hard to point to like a single biggest obstacle. I think that I don't know, something that I would definitely say is significant is just like a lack of understanding. Just a lot of people haven't thought about it too much. Policymakers have all spent some time thinking about AI at this point, but they're busy. There are a lot of issues in the world, and not everyone is necessarily paying attention. And I think that it's going to be important for people to pay attention in order, like you kind of do when there's going to be opposition to something, which there will be, on basically anything that will be meaningful. I think you do kind of have to have people who are paying attention, at the very least policymakers, and possibly you also need just like a lot more regular people paying attention as well, making sure that their policymakers are doing a good job. And I think that will happen naturally, but it's also important to try to make it happen as well. So I think that's really important. And some of the things you mentioned are also true. Obviously there's going to be the politics of it, and there's going to need to be technical research that is done. I don't think of it as one thing. It's just sort of a lot of different things.
Yeah. So given that, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about our overall ability to manage AI safely?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say that I feel optimistic or pessimistic. I think I don't know. I think things could go really well or they could go really poorly. And there are good signs and bad signs.
If you were to take one stand here.
I'm going to be a politician. I'm going to tell you that I'm not going to take. I don't know. I never like the question. Not just about AI. I just don't really like the question of optimism and pessimism. I don't know. I just try to think about what's happening and what do we need to do.
Okay. Well, Thomas, thank you so much for your time. From my perspective, you presented a very measured and nuanced perspective when it comes to policy, and I hope that it made our listeners feel more optimistic about the fact that we have people like Thomas working on this, and there's a reason to be hopeful that as a society we can come together and work through the processes of government to manage this technology. So Thomas, thank you so much. Hope this piqued your interest. Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks so much for having me.